There is an hour, late in the Baltimore night, when the city goes quiet enough that you can hear the past. The Lord Baltimore Hotel rises above West Baltimore Street the way it always has. 22 stories of dark red brick and limestone, its copper mansard roof long since aged to a deep, weathered green. Its uppermost floors dissolving into the kind of darkness that swallows detail and invites imagination. From the street below, it looks like what it was always meant to be: permanent, immovable, a monument to the belief that some things are built to outlast everything that happens inside them. But buildings remember, and this one remembers more than most. In the months and years that followed the stock market crash of 1929, one of the most devastating economic collapses in American history, more than 20 guests reportedly came to the Lord Baltimore Hotel and never left. Not in the way that mattered. They had lost everything the modern world had told them they were worth, and in their despair, they found their way to the upper floors of a building that, at the time, stood taller than anything else in Baltimore. The hotel does not advertise this history. It doesn't need to. The stories have traveled on their own for nearly a century. Among them, one has proven impossible to let go of. On the 19th floor, staff and guests have long reported the presence of a small girl. Cream-colored dress, dark shoes, a red ball that seems to precede her down empty hallways. She has no destination that anyone has ever been able to identify. She is only ever searching. Her name, according to the legend, is Molly. No one has been able to prove she was ever really there. And no one has been able to make her go away either. This is the story of the Lord Baltimore Hotel, how it was built, who it sheltered, what it witnessed, and why, after all these years, some of what happened inside its walls appears to have never truly left. Chapter 1. Baltimore's Rise. To understand the Lord Baltimore Hotel, you first have to understand the city that made it possible. Baltimore was never a city that arrived at greatness quietly. Founded as a colonial port in the early 18th century, and chartered in honor of George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore and founder of the Maryland colony, it grew through ambition, labor, and an almost stubborn refusal to remain small. Its harbor made it rich. Its position as a gateway between the industrial North and the agricultural South made it indispensable. By the dawn of the 20th century, Baltimore had become one of the most consequential cities in the United States. A place of smokestacks and shipyards, of immigrants arriving by the hundreds of thousands, of factories producing everything from steel to fertilizer to the flour that fed a continent. It was a city that believed in building things, big things, things meant to last. And then, in February of 1904, much of downtown Baltimore burned to the ground. The Great Baltimore Fire swept through more than 70 city blocks over the course of 2 days, destroying thousands of buildings and leaving the commercial heart of the city in ash and rubble. It was one of the most catastrophic urban fires in American history, and yet, within weeks, the cranes were going up. Baltimore did not mourn its losses for long. It cleared the wreckage and began again, this time with wider streets, stronger materials, and a larger vision of what the city could become. The fire, devastating as it was, became an act of accidental urban renewal. The city that rose from its ashes was more ambitious than the one that had burned. Into that moment of reinvention stepped a man named Harry Busick. A native of Calvert County, Maryland, Busick had spent the better part of his adult life learning the hotel business from the inside out. Managing properties across Baltimore, including the New Howard Hotel, building a reputation as a man who understood what a great city needed from its great hotels. He was not a dreamer in the abstract sense. He was a builder in the most practical one. Before the fire, Busick had operated a modest hotel on a corner lot at 20 West Baltimore Street, a property known as the Caswell House. It was not a grand establishment, but it was his, and it ran well enough. The fire took it. Busick could have rebuilt what he lost. Instead, he chose to build something the city had never seen. He spent the next 2 decades acquiring the capital, the land, and the vision to do it properly. Baltimore had shown him what was possible when a city decided to reach for something larger than itself. He intended to reach with it. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monument. Harry Busick had a phrase for what he intended to build. He wanted, in his own words, a super hotel, a single establishment that would provide adequate facilities for a fast-developing city's expanding activities. It was not a modest ambition, but then Busick was not a modest man, and Baltimore in the 1920s was not a city that rewarded modesty. For the project, Busick turned to William Lee Stoddard, an architect whose reputation had been built, quite literally, one hotel at a time. Born in Tenafly, New Jersey, Stoddard had studied architecture at Columbia University before spending a decade apprenticing under one of New York's most respected architectural offices. By the time Busick came to him, Stoddard had spent the better part of 3 decades designing urban hotels across the eastern United States, refining a philosophy that prized efficiency, professionalism, and a quality of design that made guests feel, from the moment they arrived, that they had entered was somewhere genuinely worth entering. Many who have studied his body of work consider the Lord Baltimore to be the fullest expression of everything he had learned. It is, in the judgment of architectural historians, among the finest buildings he ever produced. What Stoddard designed was a structure built to be unmistakable. The hotel rose 22 stories above West Baltimore Street, 289 feet of dark red brick veneer over a steel frame, shaped in a deliberate U formation that gave the building both structural strength and a sense of mass that announced itself from blocks away. The exterior was not merely tall, it was ornamented with the kind of deliberate detail that the 20th century would largely abandon. Lionhead medallions circled the 17th floor, carved in stone, their expressions fixed somewhere between authority and warning. At the building's base, stone medallions bearing the Indian head and Lord Baltimore insignias anchored the facade to the ground, connecting the structure's soaring height to the history of the city beneath its feet. Limestone trim ran throughout, brightening the dark brick and giving the building its characteristic contrast, imposing from a distance, intricate up close. The architectural language Stoddard drew from was one that had originated in the grand art schools of 19th century Paris, a style known as Beaux-Arts, born from a rejection of rigid neoclassicism in favor of something more theatrical, fusing elements of Imperial Rome, the Italian Renaissance, and the French Baroque into compositions of deliberate scale and confidence. In the Lord Baltimore, that tradition found one of its most assured American expressions. Inside, the scale only deepened. The lobby greeted guests with squared piers topped by Corinthian capitals, brass chandeliers suspended above a floor that opened into a mezzanine level rimmed with ornate ironwork. The ceiling bloomed with carved floral detail. Venetian glass caught and scattered the light in ways that made the space feel less like a hotel lobby and more like the anteroom of something much older and much more important. From the lobby, a marble staircase rose to the main dining room, its walls punctuated by mirrored transoms and tall windows that flooded the space with light. The Calvert Ballroom, anchored by 3 original Baccarat crystal chandeliers, could accommodate the kind of occasion that a city marks in its memory for generations. The banquet hall seated 1,250 guests. Nothing about the interior suggested that the men who built it had considered the possibility of anything less than permanence. The entire structure was completed in under 7 months, a pace that, given the scale and complexity of what was being built, bordered on the extraordinary. It opened in the final days of December, 1928. Governor Albert Ritchie was the first to sign the guest register. Mayor William F. Browning stood among the assembled dignitaries. John Calvert of Philadelphia, the oldest living representative of the founding Baltimore family whose name the hotel bore, addressed the gathered crowd. An orchestra played from the marble staircase as approximately 1,200 guests moved through the lobby for the first time. The ceremonies were broadcast live on WBAL radio. Room rates began at $3 a night, and every room came equipped with its own radio, a luxury so new that it was listed in the hotel's early brochures as a feature worth remarking upon. The Lord Baltimore Hotel opened as the largest hotel in Maryland. It dominated the Baltimore skyline, and it stood, from the moment its doors opened, as something the city would not see again. The last high-rise building constructed in downtown Baltimore with classical ornamentation. Every structure that came after would speak a different architectural language. This one had said everything it needed to say on the first day. Chapter 3. Ambition, Celebrity, and a City at its Peak. Harry Busick did not live long enough to see what his hotel became. In January of 1930, just over a year after the Lord Baltimore opened its doors, Busick died in an accident. He had spent the better part of 2 decades building something meant to outlast him. It did. But the man who had imagined a super hotel at the center of a fast-developing city would not be the one to watch it flourish. That task fell to his 3 sons. H. Nelson, Morton, and Howard Busick stepped into the management of the hotel, carrying the weight of their father's vision and the uncertainty of an era that had already begun to crack beneath the surface of its own prosperity. They proved, against considerable odds, to be capable and committed stewards. Under their watch, the Lord Baltimore did not merely survive the years that followed. It became the undisputed center of Baltimore's civic and social life. The numbers told part of the story. More than 20,000 square feet of event space, a banquet hall that could seat over 1,000 guests, a calendar of dinners, galas, political gatherings, and civic ceremonies that made the hotel less a place you visited and more a place where the life of the city was conducted. If something mattered in Baltimore, there was a reasonable chance it was happening inside the Lord Baltimore Hotel. The amenities Busick had built into the property continued to draw guests who expected the best and found it. Radios in every room became a selling point that kept the Lord Baltimore ahead of its competition, circulating ice water, accessible rates that made comfort feel attainable, and a staff trained to the standard that the building's architecture demanded. The hotel positioned itself as something for everyone of consequence passing through Baltimore, and for decades, that is precisely what it was. What the guests did not know was what lay behind a concealed door in the corner of the Calvert Ballroom. Prohibition had arrived in America in 1920, nearly a decade before the Lord Baltimore opened, and it had not stopped Baltimore's appetite for a drink. Tucked behind that hidden entrance was a 2-story speakeasy, an intimate, entirely illegal gathering place where the city's elite came after hours to do what the law had decided they could not do in the open. It was a room of low light and lower inhibitions, a place where the formality of the ballroom above gave way to something considerably less restrained. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the speakeasy quietly ceased to be what it had been. A wall went up, a door was sealed, and one of the hotel's most remarkable secrets was converted into a storage space and effectively forgotten, buried inside the building like a confidence no one had thought to keep. The decades that followed were generous to the Lord Baltimore. In 1938, the Society of Mayflower Descendants convened inside the hotel, a gathering that spoke to the building standing as a venue of genuine national significance. In 1944, artists John and Mabel Georgi were commissioned to paint a series of murals in the Calvert Ballroom, depicting scenes of historic Baltimore and its founders. A cultural investment that treated the hotel not as a commercial enterprise, but as an institution worth adorning, worth taking seriously as a keeper of the city's story. And then there were the guests. Amelia Earhart, who by the mid-1930s had already completed the first solo transatlantic flight by a woman and earned a place among the most celebrated figures of her age, stayed at the Lord Baltimore, adding her name, however briefly, to the building's constellation of remarkable visitors. Babe Ruth, the greatest baseball player of his generation, and perhaps of any generation, stayed during his final visit to Baltimore in July of 1948, a visit that carried, in retrospect, the particular weight of a farewell. Olivia de Havilland arrived while making the promotional rounds for a film that would become one of the most successful in the history of American cinema, Gone with the Wind, and found in the Lord Baltimore the kind of surroundings that matched the scale of the moment. Carol Channing, the actress and performer, whose presence filled any room she entered, became something close to a regular, her returns to the hotel carrying the warmth of someone coming back to a place that felt like her own. The war years brought a different kind of gravity. Baltimore transformed itself into one of the most productive wartime cities in the nation, its shipyards running day and night, its factories retooled for military production, the Martin Marietta Company turning out long-range bombers from facilities just outside the city limits. The Lord Baltimore became the gathering place for a city living under the particular tension of wartime, the celebrations and the farewells, the relief of news from overseas, and the dread of it in equal measure. The hotel held all of it, absorbing the emotional weather of the era without changing the quality of its stone or the brightness of its chandeliers. By any measure, these were the golden years. The hotel thrived, the city surged. The Busick sons had honored what their father built, and the building had honored the city that commissioned it. Chapter 4: The Crash That Never Left. It arrived on a Thursday, October the 24th, 1929, the day the financial architecture of the modern world revealed itself to be far more fragile than anyone had been willing to admit. On that single day, over 16 million shares changed hands on the New York Stock Exchange in a cascade of panic selling that no intervention could slow and no reassurance could stop. The losses that followed in the days and weeks after were staggering. Fortunes that had taken generations to build, gone in hours. By the time the markets found their floor, the damage was not merely financial, it was civilizational. The Great Depression that followed touched every city in America, but it did not touch them all the same way. Baltimore felt the contraction in its bones. Businesses shuttered along streets that had been prosperous the previous spring. Families who had never missed a payment on anything found themselves with nothing left to pay with. Men who had defined themselves entirely by their work discovered that the work was gone, and with it, the only identity they had ever known. Unemployment climbed, breadlines formed. A generation of Americans found themselves living in a country that had stopped making room for them. The Lord Baltimore Hotel maintained its operations through those years. Its chandeliers kept burning, its staircase kept rising. From the outside, and from within its lobbied interior, it remained what it had always been, a monument to the idea that some things endure. But the hotel was also, at that time, one of the tallest structures in Baltimore, and height during those years carried a terrible significance. In the aftermath of the crash, and throughout the darkest years of the Depression, more than 20 incidents were reported at the Lord Baltimore. Guests who arrived at the hotel carrying losses too heavy to survive. They were people overcome by despair so complete that the weight of it became impossible to carry. They were businessmen, families, individuals who had perhaps come to the hotel in search of one last moment of the life they had known, before the reality of what they had lost became too much to bear. The hotel's upper floors became associated with these losses in a way that no passage of time has been able to fully dissolve. It became a place where grief left a residue. Among the stories that attached themselves to those years, one proved more durable than all the others. A family, the story goes, came to the Lord Baltimore in the desperate weeks following the crash. A couple and their young daughter, a child of around 7 years old. Perhaps they came because the hotel represented something they were not yet ready to surrender. The comfort of beautiful surroundings, the dignity of a room with a proper door that closed the world out for a little while. Perhaps they simply had nowhere else they wanted to be. The accounts differ, as accounts passed down through decades always do. What the legend holds, in its most persistent form, is that the couple was overcome by the weight of what they faced, and that the couple did not leave the hotel the way they had arrived. Their daughter's name, according to the story, was Molly. It is important to say clearly what can and cannot be known. No contemporaneous newspaper record, coroner's report, or hotel registry entry has ever surfaced to confirm this specific story as historical fact. Molly exists in the documentary record not as a person, but as a legend, a story that has been passed between staff members and guests, whispered in hallways and repeated in guest reviews and ghost tour accounts, surviving every change of ownership and every renovation the building has undergone across nearly a century of continuous use. But legends do not persist for a century without carrying something true inside them. Whatever Molly's story is or is not in its precise historical details, she represents something that is absolutely, verifiably real, the invisible toll of the Depression on its smallest and most voiceless victims. The children who had no understanding of what a stock market was, or why its collapse should mean that the world their parents had built for them was suddenly gone. They bore the weight of a catastrophe they had played no part in creating. Most of them left no record at all. Molly, real or legend, is the record. And she has, according to those who have worked and stayed in the Lord Baltimore across the decades, never quite left. The reports have come from staff and guests alike, spanning generations of ownership and multiple complete renovations of the building's interior. They describe, with a consistency that is difficult to entirely dismiss, a small figure seen on the 19th floor. A child always accompanied by a red ball that seems to travel with her down corridors that, when investigated, are found to be empty. The sound of a child crying has been reported coming from rooms that, when opened, contain no one. Elevator cars have been observed traveling unbidden to the 19th floor, their doors opening onto a hallway where nothing moves and no one stands, at least no one visible. In one of the upper penthouses, a handprint has been reported on the wall, persistent through cleanings and repaints, as though whatever left it has no intention of being erased. And in the Calvert Ballroom, guests and staff have over the years reported seeing two figures moving across the floor, elegantly dressed, unhurried, dancing, some have said, in the particular way of people who are no longer concerned with time. They are believed by those who follow these stories to be Molly's parents, still present in the room where Baltimore's finest once gathered, still moving together in whatever form of together is available to them now. None of this has been proven. All of it has been reported. The distinction matters, and the hotel has always been careful to acknowledge it. What is not in dispute is the atmosphere of the 19th floor, a quality that investigators and casual guests alike have noted independently across years and decades without coordination or prior suggestion. A heaviness, a quiet that feels occupied rather than empty. The sense, which some visitors describe and others entirely dismiss, that the floor has not forgotten what it once witnessed. The Lord Baltimore kept its doors open through the Depression. It kept its marble polished, its standards maintained. It did what it was built to do. It endured. But endurance is not the same as forgetting, and this building has never forgotten. Chapter 5. Civil Rights at the Lord Baltimore. The Lord Baltimore Hotel had always presented itself as a place for everyone of consequence. The truth, for most of its early history, was considerably narrower than that. Baltimore in the 1950s was a city divided along lines that had been drawn long before anyone currently living had been born. Segregation governed its public accommodations through ordinances and customs that had calcified over decades into something that felt, to those who enforced them, like the natural order of things. The Lord Baltimore, for all its civic prestige, was no exception. Its lobbies and guest rooms, its ballroom and dining rooms were available to a specific portion of Baltimore's population and closed, by policy, to everyone else. In 1958, the Baltimore City Council considered legislation that would have prohibited racial segregation in public accommodations across the city. The council deliberated, and then it failed to pass the ordinance. The law that might have compelled change did not exist. The Busick family did not wait for it. Without legal obligation, without external pressure sufficient to force the decision, the family that had built and managed the Lord Baltimore Hotel for 3 decades voluntarily ended its own restrictive guest policies. It was a choice made against the prevailing current, in a city whose legislature had just declined to act, in a country where the civil rights movement was still years from its most consequential victories. The hotel simply opened its doors, fully, to everyone. The significance of that decision was made immediate by who walked through those doors next. That year's Major League Baseball All-Star Game brought to Baltimore 3 of the greatest players of their generation, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, and Frank Robinson. Aaron, who played for the Milwaukee Braves, was already establishing himself as one of the most consistently brilliant hitters the game had ever produced. A man who would go on to break the most celebrated record in American sports with a quiet, relentless excellence that never required an audience's permission to be great. Willie Mays of the New York Giants was, to many who watched him play, simply the finest all-around baseball player alive. A center fielder of almost supernatural capability, whose nickname, the Say Hey Kid, captured something of the joy he brought to a game he made look effortless. Frank Robinson, then with the Cincinnati Reds, was the kind of player who made opposing managers uneasy before he even stepped to the plate. A ferocious competitor who would become the only player in the history of Major League Baseball to win the Most Valuable Player award in both the National and the American League. All 3 men stayed at the Lord Baltimore Hotel. In 1958 America, that was not a small thing. It was, in its quiet way, an act of institutional courage. A declaration, made in marble and brass rather than words, that the hotel's standards applied to its guests without exception. 7 years later, the Lord Baltimore became the setting for a moment of considerably larger historical weight. On April 2nd, 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to the hotel to attend a regional meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He held a press conference from within the building, placing him, and by extension the movement he led, at the center of Baltimore's civic conversation. The city's mayor presented him with the keys to the city. The Lord Baltimore Hotel was now the stage on which one of the most consequential figures in American history received his city's highest civic honor. The building did not comment on the distance it had traveled. Buildings never do. But the distance was real, and it was remarkable. Chapter 6. From Icon to Ruin. Every great institution has a moment when the thread connecting it to its original purpose begins, almost imperceptibly, to fray. For the Lord Baltimore Hotel, that moment arrived in April of 1960. The Busick family sold the property to a New York businessman named Herbert R. Weisberg for $7,150,000. It was, by any measure, a substantial sum. It was also the end of something that no subsequent owner would quite manage to replace. Not the building, which remained, but the continuity of purpose that had kept it coherent across so many years of change. Weisberg arrived with plans for renovation and redecorating. He was not wrong that the hotel needed attention, but attention, it turned out, was not enough. By 1967, Weisberg had filed for bankruptcy. By 1969, the Lord Baltimore Hotel went to auction, the first falling of a set of dominoes that would continue, with dispiriting regularity, for the next 2 decades. What was happening to the hotel was inseparable from what was happening to Baltimore itself. The post-war decades had not been kind to American downtowns, and Baltimore was no exception. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s and the 60s to the 70s, the pattern repeated itself across the city with the relentlessness of a tide going out. Residents moved to the suburbs, businesses followed them, and the commercial heart of the city grew quieter, then emptier, then something close to hollow. The city did not collapse, but it contracted steadily and visibly, in ways that the hotel on West Baltimore Street could not insulate itself from, no matter how distinguished its lobby remained. The 1970s found the Lord Baltimore still functioning, still relevant enough to serve as political headquarters. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Harry Hughes established his campaign base inside the hotel during his successful 1978 bid for the Maryland governorship, maintaining a tradition that had seen both parties use the Lord Baltimore as a seat of political operation for decades. The building could still draw the people who shaped the state's direction, but usefulness and vitality are different things, and by the close of the decade, the distance between them had become difficult to ignore. Successive ownership attempts could not reverse what time and neglect had compounded. What the hotel needed was not a refresh. It needed reinvention on a scale that none of its owners through those years had the means or the will to deliver. In 1982, the Lord Baltimore Hotel closed its doors. The same year, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The timing had the quality of a cruel irony. The historic designation arrived at the precise moment the building ceased to function as a hotel at all. The plaque and the padlock arrived together. What followed was the particular silence of a great building left to itself. The lobby that had welcomed 1,200 guests on opening night sat dark. The Calvert Ballroom, where the murals still watched from the walls and the chandeliers still hung above a floor that had held generations of Baltimore's finest occasions, gathered dust in the quiet. The staircase led nowhere that anyone was going. There is a particular kind of melancholy specific to great things in decline, not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the slower, duller ache of watching something magnificent diminish by degrees. A local developer named Saul Perlmutter purchased the property in 1983 and began the work of bringing it back. By 1985, the Lord Baltimore reopened. It was a moment of genuine optimism, brief as it proved to be. By 1987, Perlmutter's partnership had filed for bankruptcy, casualties of the savings and loan crisis that was consuming financial institutions across the country. What followed was a long managed plateau. the hotel passing through several ownership arrangements across the 1990s and into the 2000s, surviving without truly living. It was a building being maintained rather than believed in, managed by institutions that understood its commercial potential without quite grasping what the Lord Baltimore had once meant to the city that built it. Chapter 7: The Paranormal Legacy. The renovation work of the early 1980s appears, in the accounts of those who were present and those who arrived afterward, to have unsettled something. Reports of unexplained activity, which had existed in quieter form through the hotel's earlier decades, intensified. Staff began speaking of it more openly. Guests began writing it down. The 19th floor, which had carried its particular reputation since the Depression years, became the acknowledged center of the hotel's paranormal geography. A floor that longtime employees learned to treat with a certain deliberate respect, and that some preferred not to visit after dark if the visit could be avoided. The cold is what most accounts mention first. Not the ordinary cold of an underheated corridor, but something more specific. Pockets of air, localized and sudden, that have no relationship to the building's climate systems, and no explanation that facility managers have ever been able to provide. Accompanying the cold, in many accounts, are sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, voices at a register too low to resolve into words, and what some describe as the sound of a ball reportedly moving across a hard floor. The elevator is its own chapter. Staff have logged, and guests have reported independently, the experience of watching elevator cars travel to the 19th floor without having been called there. Doors opening onto a corridor that, when examined, contains no one waiting. It happens with enough regularity that it has become part of the hotel's institutional knowledge, the kind of occurrence that longtime employees mention to newer ones, not with alarm, but with the matter-of-fact tone reserved for quirks that have long since ceased to be surprising. In the Calvert Ballroom, the chandeliers have been observed swaying in the absence of any air movement sufficient to explain it, and the dancing figures reported there in earlier years remain among the most consistently described phenomena in the hotel's paranormal history. On the mezzanine level, and throughout the upper guest floors, the complaints logged by hotel management over the years form their own kind of archive. Guests reporting presences in their rooms, voices from adjacent spaces that turn out to be empty, objects moved from where they were left to somewhere they were not. And in one of the upper penthouses, the handprint remains, small, clearly belonging to a child, resistant, according to those responsible for the building's upkeep, to the ordinary means by which marks are removed from walls. It has been there long enough that it has stopped being a curiosity and become something closer to a fixture. One more thing the building has decided, apparently, to keep. The Lord Baltimore's paranormal reputation has long since escaped Baltimore's city limits. It appears regularly on national lists compiled by publications including Forbes and Reader's Digest as one of the most haunted hotels in the United States. The Baltimore Paranormal Society conducts an annual investigation through the building. Ghost tours now move through its corridors on a regular basis, turning the building's accumulated history into something that can be walked through, pointed at, and experienced by anyone willing to pay attention in the dark. The investigators who have spent serious time on the 19th floor tend to describe it the same way, regardless of whether they arrived as believers or skeptics. No investigation conducted in the hotel has produced evidence that would satisfy a rigorous scientific standard. No recording has captured what could not be explained away. The Lord Baltimore Hotel keeps its secrets with the same composure it has always maintained, the composure of a building that has seen enough to know that most things in the end do not require an explanation. They only require acknowledgement. Chapter 8: The Rubell Era. In August of 2013, the Lord Baltimore Hotel changed hands for what would prove to be the last time in a long series of transactions defined mostly by disappointment. The buyers were different from the ones who had come before, not in their wealth or their ambition, but in their understanding of what a building like this actually was. Don Mara and Jason Rubell, operating through their Miami-based Rubell Hotels, paid $10 million for the property. They had built their reputation on hotels in places where a building's cultural weight was considered an asset rather than a complication. The Albion Hotel in South Beach, the Capitol Skyline in Washington, D.C. They were not in the business of managing decline. They were in the business of restoration in the fullest sense of the word, not merely structural, but something closer to a reckoning. Their philosophy, stated plainly, was that a hotel is not simply a place to sleep. It is a component of a city's cultural life, a place where the city gathers, where it remembers itself, where it renews its sense of what it is and what it might still become. The restoration that followed was comprehensive in a way that the hotel's previous renovation attempts had never quite managed to be. 439 guest rooms were reimagined. 10 new elevators were installed. The Calvert Ballroom was returned to something approaching its 1928 character. The chandeliers cleaned and rehung, the floor restored, the proportions of the space allowed to speak again without the interference of decades of accumulated compromise. The French kitchen dining room was lined with mirrors replicating those of the Palace of Versailles, restoring an elegance that had been present in the original design, and quietly lost somewhere in the intervening years. The lobby's original features were preserved and restored, with the attention of people who understood that these details were not decorative. They were the point. The recognition that followed arrived steadily. The Historic Hotels of America presented the Lord Baltimore with one of its awards of excellence in 2014, and a succession of national hospitality rankings followed, confirming what the Rubells had wagered, that the Lord Baltimore, properly restored, still had something to say. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic reduced the city around it to a condition of suspended animation, the Lord Baltimore opened its doors as a triage, respite, and isolation center for Baltimore City. It was the same instinct that had kept its ballroom open through the years of wartime uncertainty. The building, under owners who understood what it was, offering shelter to a city that needed it. Today, the Lord Baltimore Hotel operates as an independent luxury property at 20 West Baltimore Street, the same corner it has occupied since the final days of 1928. Its copper roof has long since completed its aging into green. Its lobby still opens above a staircase that has absorbed nearly a century of footsteps. The speakeasy is no longer a secret. The Calvert Ballroom still turns on the axis of its original chandeliers. The building had been many things across its long life. Under the Rubells, it had finally been allowed to be all of them at once. Chapter 9. The Weight That Stays. There is a version of the Lord Baltimore Hotel story that ends with the restoration. The chandeliers rehung, the speakeasy reclaimed, the building returned to something like its original intention. It is a satisfying version. It is not the complete one. The complete version holds all of it at once. The ambition of a self-made man from Calvert County who spent 2 decades earning the right to build something extraordinary. The scale of an opening night in December of 1928, when an orchestra played from a staircase and a city allowed itself to believe that some things were simply too beautiful to fail. The depression that arrived almost immediately after, pressing its full weight against walls that had barely had time to settle. The losses on the upper floors, the civil rights decisions made without legal compulsion that allowed 3 of baseball's greatest players to walk through a door that should never have been closed to them. The decades of decline, the long sequence of owners who tried and failed and tried again, the pandemic, and the building opening its doors once more to a city that needed somewhere to go. Great buildings are not merely architecture, they are vessels for ambition and grief, for the best decisions people make and the worst ones, for the ordinary lives conducted within them and the extraordinary ones that pass through. The Lord Baltimore has held all of these things across the better part of a century. Every renovation changes the surfaces. None of them has reached what lies beneath. Which brings us back, as this story always does, to Molly. Whatever she is, she represents something that the historical record has never been particularly good at preserving. The smallest victims. The ones who had no agency in the catastrophes that consumed them, who left no documents and signed no registers and appear in no newspaper accounts. The children of the Depression who bore the weight of a collapsed world, without having had any part in building it. Molly's story has survived nearly a century, not because it can be proven, but because it cannot be set aside. Some losses are simply too large to forget, and so people keep finding ways to remember them. The copper mansard roof is green now, aged by every winter Baltimore has delivered since 1928. From the street below, it still defines the skyline in the way that things built with genuine conviction tend to, not by demanding attention, but by simply being there, weathered and permanent, long after the moment that created it has passed. The Lord Baltimore Hotel is still standing, still open, still keeping whatever it is keeping. Whether that is history or memory or something for which we have not yet found the right word, that perhaps is the question the building has always been asking. It has never seemed particularly interested in answering it,